with the government reaching back out to the DEA and to the institutions of the US, we are going to see the US intelligence agencies, possibly even the US military return to Bolivia to try and relaunch the so-called war on drugs, which I think will have a similar effect as what it's had, for example, in Ecuador, where we've seen a massive spike in violent crime, a massive spike in drug production itself, because the war on drugs was never about reducing drugs. It was about destabilizing societies, about reinstalling a US military presence in societies, which in every country of Latin America has led to increased crime and increased drug production.
Hello, and welcome to Global Majority for Peace podcast. I'm Ileana Chan. Every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement to promote peace and challenge the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. We will be posting the first part here on YouTube and the full episode on our Patreon for members to watch in full. So please help sustain our work and help us diversify our platforms just in case anything happens to our YouTube channel by becoming a member on Patreon today. As this is a podcast, it will also be available on Spotify and Amazon Music every Wednesday. This week, I have the honor to announce that Ollie Vargas is joining us on Global Majority for Peace. Ollie is a British-Bolivian journalist, political analyst, and producer, formerly based in Bolivia. He is also the co-founder of Coercive News, an English language outlet reporting on Latin America. Vargas has also contributed to outlets such as Mint Press News, The Grey Zone, Telesur English, and Radio Casachuan Coca, focusing on themes of sovereignty, anti-imperialism, and social movements across the region, which is exactly what we're going to get into today. So welcome to Global Majority, Ollie.
No, thank you for having me on.
So we do like to start each interview on a little bit of a personal note. Could you tell us about the origin of your politicization? And sometimes we do like to say this, like, was there a particular incident that has led you to your worldview? Very few people can pinpoint one particular incident, but we never know. So could you talk us through your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. As you mentioned, I'm British, Bolivian. My father's from Bolivia, my mother's from the UK. And I grew up in Bolivia in my early years, and then we moved to the UK. And if I could pinpoint any, particular period, probably I would say when I was a teenager was just around the time when the austerity regime in the UK began, around the 2010s, with the Conservative Party, particularly the introduction of the tripling of tuition fees in the UK. Became very involved in the student movements around then. In the course of being involved in a movement like that, you begin to meet people, talk about issues like Palestine and Marxism, and the more you become part of that community, the more you're encouraged to look into these things and read. And I threw myself into reading a lot, and especially around Marxism. And I think it was a slow process that began there, I would say. And yeah, throughout and I was aware of the processes that were going on in Latin America at that time. Probably some of what was often referred to within Latin America as the golden years of economic growth in Latin America, led by left-wing governments, socialist governments in the majority of South America, particularly, including my own country, with Chavez in Venezuela and all of this. So all of that was incredibly exciting, because it raised the fact that not only is our side out in the streets, organizing, protesting, but can also hold political power and actually begin to implement. And what does it look like to implement some of the changes that we're out on the streets demanding in a concrete way, not just in an abstract way that sometimes these things are talked about. So that learning about the processes in Latin America was massively important for me and in politicizing me, I think.
I mean, I think that's kind of an amazing thing that you're pointing to, this idea of, like, we often in the global north think about revolution or social movements, but purely from an academic point of view, because we don't really have that thriving experience, to put it mildly, in the global north. And so to actually witness that in Latin American, well, really Bolivia. I mean, Bolivia was considered from mid 2000s to 2019 a huge source of optimism and hope for socialist and anti-imperialist movements from around the world. Just to give some sort of reference to our audience, under Evo Morales, it rose as a sovereign socialist nation and seemed to defy imperialist diktats, nationalized its resources, and achieved historic poverty reduction and development. However, this year, Rodrigo Paz from the Christian Democratic Party, described as a centrist pro-business party with a clear geopolitical alignment with the US empire, won the election with almost 55% of the vote. I mean, this is kind of a shocking development, and this is probably going to be a very long answer, but take your time and we can break it down. But, what happened? What happened, in your opinion?
The new government in Bolivia has been in power about 2 weeks now, so still early days. But you're absolutely right. I think Bolivia was a very important part of the transformations that we saw in Latin America throughout the 2000s. Evo Morales won his first election to be elected president in 2005. And since then, his party, the movement towards socialism, called the MAS, has won every election from then, from 2005 up until now. And this was the election that they had just a couple of months ago, was the first one that they lost. But in that time, Bolivia turned into a kind of a reference point and an inspiration for the whole region, because what we had here was the country's first indigenous president in an indigenous majority country, who came from the ranks of the trade unions, in his case, the Coca Growers Rural Farm Workers Union, and didn't have the opportunities to study at university or go through the NGOs like many so-called progressive figures in different parts of the world end up being filtered through. He came through the organizations of Bolivia's working class and gained power and built an economy that, for the first time in Bolivia, turned Bolivia from the poorest country in South America into the region's fastest growing economy, with growth rates of 6, 7, 8% throughout much of his time. And that became through the nationalization of natural resources. That was the biggest issue. Bolivia is a country that has lots of natural gas, lots of mineral wealth in mining. And up until Evo Morales came in, from the neoliberal period in the 80s up until Morales' election, that was all in private hands of foreign corporations, in which the profits of that wealth all went to foreign shareholders. But with Evo Morales, all of those revenues came into the state coffers, which could then be spent on things like infrastructure, poverty reduction, social programs, public health, all of these things. And, the achievements are extraordinary. The rate of poverty when Evo Morales won in 2005 in Bolivia was around 67%. So around 2/3 of the country lived below the UN-defined poverty line. Today, that figure is less than 30% because of these measures. And behind that figure, of fluctuating percentages, is millions of people whose lives were transformed during that period. And in that period, Bolivia became a real country insofar as it had real infrastructure for the first time. Up until that point, the country, which is very large in landmass, was almost entirely disconnected from each region, was disconnected from itself through a lack of development, lack of infrastructure, lack of roads. That will change with Evo Morales. And also, socially and politically, kind of creating a new model. They brought in a new constitution, which brought in the participation of indigenous movements, of workers' unions, and bringing those social sectors into the structures of government, and creating a much more participatory democracy rather than a kind of top-down liberal conception of democracy of, you elect your representatives to govern on high for 5 years and you don't get a say in between. This was a model of democracy that was actually where unions, working class organizations and indigenous movements were brought into the structures of the state and had decision-making powers over things like the appointment of ministers, the appointment of figures within the military and the police, over policies in agriculture and industry. It was a very democratic movement, bringing in a much more popular form of democracy. And the economic growth during that time, I think, was really held up within the region as a massive success story. Of course, in the rest of South America, you also had governments of the left to varying degrees. You had Chavez in Venezuela, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, Lula in Brazil, Cristina Kirchner in Argentina. You know, a number of other countries, even smaller countries like Paraguay and Uruguay, had their own leftist presidents during this time. And it was an incredibly exciting period, deal of unity, of integration, of these countries coming together, having cross-border economic strategies, investing in each other's economies, cooperation between state companies. And it was energy cooperation, which is very important during that time. And all of this was, you know, in terms of human development, and the figures are all there in terms of poverty reduction. These were Latin America's golden years. Unfortunately, what happened there was, I think there was, in terms of how many of these governments came to fall, not all of them, but some of them. I mean, we could talk all day about this, but I think that fundamentally there was political weaknesses here. I think many of these governments were unable to control various parts of the state, despite having won elections democratically. The institutions of this is one thing to win an election, is another thing to control every institution of the state. And within a state, you know, what is the state? What is the government? It's a collection of different vested interests at the end of the day. And institutions such as the military, such as the police, are powers in and of themselves. And that's what a lot of these governments came to face. Most of these governments faced coups or coup attempts by forces within their own state, and which they were unable to remove, despite holding the presidency. I think a lot of these governments as well were very unprepared for the war of propaganda, the communication war that came during those years, with especially there was the rise of social media throughout this time, you know, in the 2000s to 2010s, where social media becomes the main form of communication among people on platforms owned by the United States, of course, manipulated algorithms, campaigns of disinformation. And I think these governments are very unprepared for the strength of these campaigns conducted by the right within their own countries, and then the bourgeoisie within their own countries, but also with the funding of the United States, which in every country in this period funneled millions into not only these campaigns on social media, but also direct funding for entire media outlets, direct funding for political parties, candidates, different leaders. And in this period, we saw a weakening of these governments politically.
That's a really interesting point, because it's kind of hard to imagine now that social media wasn't what it is now. You know, it's because it's everywhere. We're just so used to it that we don't think about that. Even like 20 years ago, it just wasn't as influential as it is now. And also, I think in hindsight, now we can look at China's banning of these social media platforms as really one of their saving graces in terms of fortifying their country against US influence. So yeah, that's a really interesting point. And so in your view, what do you think could have been done differently? Obviously, it was just armchair assessments, but you know, like, what do you think could Evo Morales could have done differently that would have led to a different outcome?
I mean, if we're talking about the most recent election, unfortunately in Bolivia, what we saw was a split within the left between those around Evo Morales and different factions within the party, and that division within the left opening the door for the right. And by the way, this was a process that kind of happened in many of these countries, not nearly as severely as in Bolivia, but to differing levels in a lot of countries. And I think the internal problems and internal conflicts for power, for who controls different portions of the state, is a very difficult thing to manage politically, and it'd probably always be a problem. And the statesmanship and leadership needed to navigate those things is a question that every movement, I think, has to face. But I think, of course, as I said, on wider terms, I think these governments faced a lot of political weaknesses in the war of communications, which is very difficult in matching the resources that the United States has in that realm, but also in being able to transform all of the institutions of the state. without a doubt, Evo Morales wouldn't have faced a coup in 2019 if he had able to truly transform, for example, the military and the police, which are the forces that led the coup against him. Again, as I said, this is a similar thing happened in most of these countries, either successful coups or coup attempts. It's easier said than done, this project. It's not a case of you reach the presidency and you pass a law to say we're going to bring in all comrades and good people into the police and military. These are institutions that have deeply organized structures that when governments try to intervene within them and change things up, often that's when a coup occurs. And at the end of the day, they're the people with the guns. They're the people with the power to just remove you from the office that you're physically in. And so it became a war of positioning and different strategies to try and maybe we can move this person. Now that's this time is extremely complicated. Of course, the experiences in places like Cuba or China is very different because those governments came to power through revolutions in which the entire state collapsed and a new state was built from scratch in its place. So when you're building something from scratch, you can build it in the way that you want. And in both cases, the structures were already there in terms of having they already had, for example, a guerrilla army that becomes the official army. But when you come to power through elections, it's much more difficult because you are then put at the head of a state organization that already exists, already has its own ways of functioning, and already has its own vested interests and powers lying within it, even if you are put at the head of it. So of course, it's very complicated, but the fact that it is complicated doesn't mean that one has to shy away from for a new reality that those institutions of the state have to be transformed.
That's really a good point, and it makes me think of the Sahel alliance states that rose to power through military coups. So, sovereign revolutionary military coups, but that's probably, and obviously they're very young. It's like only a few years right now. So we'll see what happens, but hopefully it's an optimistic sign. Maybe I'm just going to hold on to my optimism and we'll go from there. But I mean, Evo Morales did a lot of things to try to shield Bolivia from Western influence. I mean, including cutting ties with US-backed institutions like the IMF and World Bank. In 2018, Bolivia also joined China's Belt and Road Initiative. I think a lot of Latin American countries in 2018 joined the Belt and Road Initiative. With today's geopolitical realignment and renewed cooperation, Bolivia's renewed cooperation with the IMF, World Bank, and the US, I think very recently was kind of announced that that was happening. What do you think this is going to mean for Bolivia's current path of development?
Well, I think we know what's going to happen because it's something that was already taken place in Bolivian history from the 1980s up until the election of Evo Morales, was the implementation of the neoliberal model, what's called in Bolivia the neoliberal period, in which these organizations like the IMF and World Bank came in and dictated the country's economic policy, dictated, of course, the same recipe they applied to every country, which is privatization of state assets, austerity and social programs, tax relief and tax breaks to big corporate interests. And what was the result? The result was massive increases in poverty. The result was the figure I mentioned earlier, Bolivia arrived at 2005 with 2/3 of its population living below the poverty line, with no real infrastructure to speak of connecting the major hubs of the country. This is the reality, and this is, unfortunately, the path they're going to attempt to replicate. Now, whether they're going to be able to implement all of that will depend on whether Bolivian people are able to organize and fight back. I think it will. I think Bolivia is a country with highly organized social movements, unions, etc., and an enormously rebellious and insurrectionary history and social tradition. And so I think that although the current government has won an election, that doesn't mean they're going to serve their entire term necessarily. I think when these policies become a reality, when we see public services be destroyed, the hospitals and the schools that were built under Evo Morales fall to pieces, when we see the state companies privatized and their revenue that they brought in disappear, which causes public services to fall apart. When that becomes a real reality, I think we'll see Bolivian people rise up and prevent the worst excesses of that. But that is the path they're attempting to take at the moment. And as we see it, the current government is reaching out to these international organizations to bring in loans. The loans come with these conditions. So this is the path they're going down.
Do you think that because it is still part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and I'm assuming there's still development projects ongoing with that, I'm not sure though. Do you think that will mitigate any of the effects?
Well, I think with this current government, will attempt to navigate reorientating the country towards the United States while not entirely destroying their ties with China. I mean, every country in Latin America, almost every country in Latin America, their largest trading partner is China, regardless of whether they're a government of the left or a government of the right. I mean, the government in Peru, for example, is a right-wing government, is a neoliberal government, but they just a year ago, almost exactly now, they built, this enormous, one of the largest ports in Latin America with Chinese investment. Everyone wants to work with China, regardless of ideology. No one wants to cut those ties completely. We'll see what happens in that regard, because now we have, with Trump in the White House, he is now trying to exert pressure on third countries to try and roll back some of those ties. We'll see how successful that is. So far, that hasn't really happened. But I think the government will try to maintain any investment they can from China. What that relationship will depend on is if the United States makes demands of Bolivia to reduce those ties. We'll see. We haven't heard any concrete news about that so far. But if that does take place, then I'm sure the Bolivian government will have to comply because their sponsor is Washington.
Yeah, I think that seems to be kind of, not that I'm into fortune telling, but that seems to be the direction that the US is sort of striving towards. And lots of think tanks saying that the US wants a war with China by 2027, for example. And of course, this year we've had what the US has coined narco terrorism in Latin America. Specifically, when it comes to Bolivia, in mid-November, Bolivia reopened cooperation with the US, DEA, for the first time in 20 years. So that's obviously not a coincidence because it's at the same time as this so-called US's Operation Southern Spear is expanding US military operations in the Caribbean. I mean, this is all under the guise of like narco terrorism, which obviously the terrorism part of it allows the US to completely bypass any sort of democratic processes or due diligence and it's just about intervention. Essentially, it gives them the pretext for intervention. Now, given Bolivia's renewed ties, what do you think this means for the country? Like, there's so many things that you've already said that does give me sort of maybe just questions about, for example, the population is under Evo Morales, under these very strong trade union socialist ideas and ideals and mobilizations. How are they reacting to this push by the US?
Yeah, well, unfortunately in Bolivia, there's a great deal of division within, I referenced earlier, division within the left and within not only the political parties of the left, but also within the organizations behind them, which are the unions, trade unions, the organized indigenous movement, who became split along the lines of what's been going on the past few years, which is the candidacy of Evo Morales over candidacy of the last president, Luis Arce. And I think those divisions are so damaging that they're still in place today. The left is still absolutely in disarray with no single pole to organize. If there is able to be a rearticulation of an internal reorganization and rearticulation, then I think that we'll see the left in a very strong position. I think the left is still the social majority in Bolivia. I mean, we saw with the most recent elections in which the left was at its weakest that there had been in 20 years. So we can see that the social base still exists. It just doesn't have an organization, a unified organization. So I think that the most important task is an internal reunification of the movement. And once that is able to be articulated, they'll be able to take on some of these neoliberal policies. And I mean, the current government has only been in power about 2 weeks. They haven't been able to implement many of their big flagship policies, such as privatization, just yet. I think their strategy will be to do these things very slowly because they're very aware of the reaction it will cause within the population. But I think the most important question, absolutely, is rebuild the organizations of the left. And without that articulation, there will not be a real response.
So, in terms of the concept of this narco-terrorism, I mean, the horrific thing with Venezuela, or the ridiculous thing with Venezuela, is that it's already been certified by the UN as not being a significant drug producer, something like 5% of the world's cocaine or something like that, and not a significant amount at all. In terms of Bolivia, is drugs an actual issue, perhaps that it would be galvanizing for the population on the ground, or how significant is it as an issue?
Well, historically, the war on drugs has been a big issue in Bolivia. Before the election of Evo Morales, the war on drugs was a pretext for the US to have a military presence in the country through the DEA. And the reason Bolivia, in particular, has been put into this framework of the war on drugs is because Bolivia is a producer of the coca leaf, which is one of the base ingredients for the production of cocaine. But the leaf itself is not a narcotic. The leaf itself is something that goes back thousands of years in indigenous culture. People use it to this day. For example, that people chew coca, people have coca tea, and this is not a recognized drug or narcotic in any way whatsoever. And it has a massive traditional use, especially in indigenous culture, which is the majority of Bolivia, majority of the country. The United States in the 2000s began a strategy of eliminating all coca production, despite it being such an important part of Bolivian culture and indigenous culture. They began a strategy of eradication, total eradication of the crop in the country. But what was really behind this was not a concern about its potential use in drug production. What it was about mobilizing the US military presence and US forces within Bolivia to destroy the left, because the producers of the coca leaf, the rural workers who produce the coca leaf, have highly organized unions, and this was a strategy to break that organization. The DEA is then expelled from Bolivia in 2009 by Evo Morales due to the fact that they weren't there to stop drug production. They were there to intervene in the politics of the country. So they were expelled. And we actually see then a strategy under Evo Morales' government towards the coca leaf. This held up actually internationally, even at the level of the UN and different NGOs, as a model strategy of how to tackle this issue of drugs. Because what Evo Morales' government did was say, okay, this is the amount of coca leaf production that's needed for legitimate use, and we'll legalize this production. We'll end the criminalization and repression of farmers who produce the coca leaf. This amount of coca leaf, and of course anything beyond this determined amount, will be considered illicit, and that would be eradicated. And he worked with the unions to draw up this policy and implement this policy, and brought the unions into the implementation of it as well. And this was held up as a huge success. The production of coca leaf went down. The share of Bolivia's export of cocaine went down massively during this period after the expulsion of the DEA. And even, within international organizations like the UN's drug agency, even US-based NGOs had to recognize the success of this policy after the DEA had been expelled. However, I think now, with the government reaching back out to the DEA and to the institutions of the US, we are going to see the US intelligence agencies, possibly even the US military, return to Bolivia to try and relaunch the so-called war on drugs, which I think will have a similar effect as what it's had, for example, in Ecuador, where we've seen a massive spike in violent crime, a massive spike in drug production itself, because the war on drugs was never about reducing drugs. It was about destabilizing societies, about reinstalling a US military presence in societies, which in every country of Latin America has led to increased crime and increased drug production.
Thank you for watching the first part of our interview. Please head over to patreon.com/Empire Watch to watch the full episode. The podcast is also available as an audio on Spotify and Amazon Music every Saturday.